working on dam removals. And then lastly, we really want to try to find and connect everyone working on dam removal in New Jersey, just to, again, to build that momentum and to make sure nobody's out there reinventing the wheel, but, making sure we can all work together to get more done and to get it done better. Okay, we're going to ask for folks to hold their questions until the end. You can go ahead and put your questions in chat, but just to make sure we get all the material, through all the material without stopping too much. I'm guilty of spending a lot of time on questions. So put your questions into chat as they occur to you. And know that some of these topics that we're touching on, we'll be expanding on a little bit more in future webinars. So not that we'll decline a question, but we might kind of put it forward to another session. I'll remind everyone again to mute, and then we'll just get started with our session. Okay, just an overview. If when you registered, you would have seen our agenda for today, but we're going to do the kind of very basics, spend a little bit of time on the very basics of what a dam is and how we judge their class and their condition, why we think dams should be removed. Those things that you need to know right at the beginning of your project. We'll take a look at engineering studies, project design, project implementation, and construction, and building your team with stakeholders and partners. And it occurs to me right now that I have not introduced myself or my co-presenter. Sorry. I am Beth Styler-Barry, and I'm the Director of River Restoration for the Nature Conservancy's New Jersey chapter. And I'm presenting today with Kathy Marion, who is, I think we're on the first slide there, the Fish and Wildlife Biologist. She also works with the NERDARC program, and she's in our New Jersey field office. These are upcoming sessions. If you haven't heard about them, if we went on a little bit earlier, we did put the links into the chat, and they're also on njdams.org. Okay, so what is a dam in New Jersey? This is the official definition here, that dams that are under the state jurisdiction are artificial barriers together with, urban works, everything that might be associated with them that raise the level of a stream 5 feet or more above the usual water level, right? And those are the regulated dams. So it's important to know that there are 1,700 regulated dams in New Jersey, but there are hundreds more that are under 5 feet and therefore not regulated. The unregulated dams can still block fish passage. They still hamper river function, and they still create impoundments that used to be floodplain, so they can also have an impact on flooding. So while we talk mostly about regulated dams, it's still pretty important. Those smaller ones are definitely on our radar. So anatomy of a dam, again, this is something that you can go a little bit deeper into njdams.org. I can't even say of a typical dam, because I don't think there is such a thing as a typical dam. They can be all kinds of shapes and sizes. You can walk past one that everybody calls the waterfall, which is in fact a dam. It might be tucked under a bridge. It might be part of a bridge. Dams can be filled with a variety of materials, including rock, concrete, timber, or earth. Sometimes we know what the construction is. We'll be lucky enough to have the design plans for a particular dam. And other times, part of what the project team has to do is figure out what that dam is made of, because it may be so old that it predated anything as modern as permits. So it could have just been put together by folks that own the property. Here's again, there is no typical dam. Here's another, this type of dam would typically be in on a bigger water body or a reservoir. But here you can see you have the pertinent works that was referred to in the definition. You have the spillway, the overflow spillway, you have an inlet in the water body, you have an outlet. So all of those are different things that help to let the dam function properly, but also are things that can fail or can require maintenance. So Simpler dam is not necessarily simple to care for. I'm going to just remind everyone again to mute, especially folks on the phone. Sometimes I know it's easy to forget. Okay, so here is a map of all of the dams in New Jersey. And basically everywhere that there were people, there were dams. So you're almost looking at something that could also be called, you know, a map of early settlement in New Jersey, because the time when dams were most useful were during earlier settlement time. So it very much follows population. So on the right, again, you're seeing all of the dams, but all of the regulated dams in New Jersey. And sorry, that's on the left. And then on the right, you're seeing that same map, but this time prioritized for ecological gains. So what sort of ecological benefits would we get if the dams were removed? And they're ranked that way. There are definitely other ways to look at the benefits of dam removal. So I'm just showing you that, you know, a sample of how an ecological ranking of those dams would look. Hazard class classification is done by the Division of Bureau of Dam Safety in New Jersey, and it's not only like a big, high, wide dam is going to have the highest hazard class. We're also always looking at what could happen downstream, right? And when I say we, I mean they. I mean, no one else except the NJDEP Bureau of Dam Safety is making these decisions. But if you have a dam that, should it fail, would have a big area of inundation, or would put a lot of people or some people at risk for loss of life, or could do a lot of property damage, you're going to have a higher hazard potential. Again, that's something that is assessed by the Bureau, and also that assessment can change over time. It can change depending on the condition of the dam. It can also change depending on changing downstream population, right? So if a dam was built 100 years ago and no one lived downstream, it may see its hazard class rise as there are 3 or 4 subdivisions downstream. Condition, again, also decided by the Bureau of Dam Safety based on the results of inspections. Inspections happen according to cycles based on the hazard classification. So a high hazard dam is going to need inspections more frequently than one of the a mid hazard dam. And then on the low hazard dam, I believe that it's kind of a self-reporting thing where you are required, I want to say even every 10 years, to do an inspection and then submit it to the state. What you're seeing in the lower right-hand corner is a little dam failure. This is from 2010. I think the same dam has failed, I think 3 or 4 times in my memory, including 2000, when we had that whole series of dams fail in Sussex County. And it was kind of this sort of cascading effect of one dam failing, sending a bunch of water downstream, causing additional. So why remove dams? There is the safety and security issues. Dams are not waterfalls. They do require maintenance and inspections to make sure that they remain safe over time. There are failures in the state of New Jersey. We have not had one as spectacular as we've seen in Oroville in California or in the Michigan dam failures, but we do have dam failures, and we have experienced both sunny day and storm event failures. So a storm event, I think everyone understands, when you have a huge storm event, you're going to put a lot of stress on those dams, and they would be more likely to fail. But there's also the quote sunny day failures, which occur just because the dam is not up to even the typical strains or pressure that we would expect it to handle. Public safety. So dams, says since the 50s, over 400 people in the USA have died. I think that statistic is probably about 5 years old. But interestingly, those drownings are increasing over time as we wind up having dams in places that went from private estates or industrial parks, winding up in the middle of places where people go to recreate. So we're seeing that number increased, and we certainly have plenty of those situations in New Jersey. And I chose to show the Finesville Dam here because it is a very innocuous looking dam. You can see the folks standing in the back so you get a good idea for scale. I think it was measured at 9 feet high. This was the site of 2 separate drownings of people in kayaks. And just weeks before the dam was removed, there was a rescue of a young angler, 16-year-old, who fell into the water and had the incredible luck of one of the neighbors passing by who happened to be a Navy SEAL diver and pulled him out. Not going to happen in the typical dam accident, but just so you can get a sense that the hydraulic below the dam can be quite dangerous, even if the dam itself looks pretty harmless. Okay, aging infrastructure. There are not a lot of new dams. I think the average age now is up to 68 or 70 or something, and I'm sure if we threw in all of the dams, it would probably creep up a bunch higher. We certainly, work on dams that are over 100 years old, even 200, rebuilt over time, but in that location. So as this infrastructure ages, if it does not get maintained and repaired, which is a costly thing, if in fact the inspections are done to dictate those repairs, then we can have an issue where we just have failure due to age. And we also now can overlay climate change on top of aging infrastructure. New Jersey has seen some of the most extreme climate change effects in the country. And that aging infrastructure will now have to be tested by those pretty drastic storm events more frequently. So while we're not seeing an increase in total number of inches falling on New Jersey, we are seeing that rainfall concentrated into the storm bursts that are exactly the kind of thing that can cause a dam failure. Again, this is Finesville again from the air. The arrow is pointing at the Finesville Dam, the one we just looked at a little bit closer. And dam removal will restore the normal functions of rivers and floodplains. So in this particular case, the dam, you can imagine, raises the water level behind it by at least 5 feet if it's regulated, right? And it also, the impoundment behind the dam kind of creeps into what should have been the floodplain, right? So we're losing floodplain and raising the water surface level. So this village was subject to pretty frequent floods. The road that you see running right next to the river, this is about 48 hours after Irene. So if you went there the day after Irene, you would be able to paddle up that road. When Finesville Dam was removed, the flood mitigation was approximately 2 feet, I believe, for the 5, 10, and 20-year storm. So, the 500-year storm, all bets are off. The 400-year storm, 250, big giant storm events are not, going to be completely mitigated by small dam removals. But I think that we can see the more we look, the more we will see the opportunity to mitigate some of this, more nuisance flooding by dam removal. Also, there is a dam that we hope to bring, a pair of dams that we hope to bring under study. And in that particular case, it's on a different river. Flood profiles indicate that the removal will mitigate flooding for the 10, 50, and 100-year floods by up to 3 feet. That is kind of a similarly situated dam in a village like this, an older village. And in that case, there's commercial properties being flooded as well. So again, a couple of examples where we can get some flood relief. Okay, the basic information you need at the beginning of your project is, seems kind of obvious, but the physical environment. Am I, in the middle of the woods or a park when I'm looking at this dam? Am I in the middle of a town, a historic village, a commercial site? What exactly is around my dam that is going to require, additional work or, going down additional avenues to get that dam out? History of the dam, I should have also mentioned in physical environment, you'd be looking around at nearby infrastructure as well, right? Like bridges, utilities, power lines, all of those other things that you're going to have to think about. You're either going to touch those things in your dam removal, or your dam removal might wind up impacting them, even if you're not physically close to those things. History, I'm going to go a little bit deeper in just a few minutes, but I'm going to talk about ownership, which sounds like something that can be super straightforward, right? You think that you're going to approach a dam and, it's belongs to Mary Smith, right? Well, first of all, it's not unusual for that property owner to not know and sometimes not want to admit that they own a dam, right? We see it very, often where people buy a piece of property that happens to be next to a waterfall, but they don't realize that that is a dam, and that when they bought their property, they purchased the dam as well, right? That happens frequently. Another issue around ownership is people will sometimes jointly own a dam. Sometimes one dam will be owned by folks on opposite sides of a river. You may have one person in favor of dam removal and one not so much. So you'll have to kind of untangle that issue as well. And in addition to the possibility of two owners, you have to remember that you are going to change the upstream impoundment, right? That mill pond or whatever upstream, which may have other owners. So ownership of not only the dam, but the upstream impoundment is important to determine pretty early on. The current condition, again, that is something that the DEP knows. So if you're, a third party interested in dam removal, the current condition of the dam is not necessarily easy for you to ascertain. But all dam removals that I have worked on or known about, they begin with a willing owner. You don't just, sometimes people say, how do you pick what dams you're going to take out? Well, it doesn't work like that at all. The dam owner has to be on board from day one. They're going to have, it is a piece of private property in general, maybe sometimes town or commercial property, but it belongs to someone and you can't take it out without their consent. So being the case, the current condition would be known by the owner. Reasons for removal. It is not unusual at all for members of the same dam removal team, including the owner, to have different reasons for wanting to remove a dam. That is actually pretty typical. So the NGO might be interested in the ecological benefits, right? A watershed association, the Nature Conservancy, we're going to be more concerned about ecological benefits. The owner might want to have the dam removed because they want to lose that liability, right? It is a public safety hazard. And they also want to lose the cost of inspections and maintenance. So they have a different set of reasons. And the town might be involved because they want to reduce flooding, right? They might have it in, they might have the idea that by taking that dam out, they would mitigate some flooding that they're dealing with, once a year or once every other year. So not unusual at all for the reasons for removal to be multiple, and for individual parties involved to have one that is the priority for them. Sensitive natural resources and regulatory issues. That is something that our permitting session will go into deeper, but not anything to be taken lightly, and definitely needs to be addressed. Basic information needed at project initiation, absolutely, right? I would say that there are very few things that would be actual deal breakers, but there are certainly things that will impact your project, your design, your cost, and your timeline. So understanding, what the regulatory situation is surrounding that dam is pretty critical from the beginning, so that you don't have wrong expectations. And lastly, the hurdles. I think anyone who knows me for 5 minutes or more would say that I am very much the glass half full person. I am always the optimist, but I will tell you, there will be hurdles. Some of them you can see coming from a mile away, you know, like some of the ones on this list. And then sometimes there are things that, you know, you would not see coming. And again, building a multidiscipline team will help you to have feelers out in a way that will help you to deal with that. So I said that there would be a special slide for history, and that is because every single dam that you are probably thinking about working on is a historic, you know, is historic by virtue of the fact that it is more than 50 years old, right? So it might, you know, you might look at something that is, you know, very, you know, recently rebuilt in the 70s and made out of concrete. And so you say to yourself, that's not a historic thing. You know, we all think of something like this dam in the picture when we think of, you know, historic dams. But in fact, you will be working with the State Historic Preservation Office, most likely on any of your dam removals. And again, it's something that is smart to start that work earlier rather than later. I can say on the first dam removal project that I ever worked on, it was exactly that case. It was a fairly recently rebuilt dam, nothing attractive or, you know, romantic about it. You know, there was nothing that said, wow, this is really a beautiful piece of history. There was none of that. And there was one sort of broken down, maybe 2 foot high piece of a mill that was nearby. There was not even the existing footprint of the mill. So we, you know, mistakenly thought that it was a, you know, kind of a box that we would check, right? But it was not that. That is not the case at all. So you are going to have to go through a process with the State Historic Preservation Office, which will be more or less involved depending on exactly the dam. But you will almost definitely need to make some connections with local historic folks and do a little bit of digging. And then in the case of something that does in fact, like the Finesville Dam was part of a historic district. Now, did that mean that we couldn't take it out? It didn't mean that, but it certainly meant that we had a lot more work to do with the community to bring them along. And we also needed to do some interpretive work afterwards, right? We needed to put some signage in there that showed, you know, why the dam is there, what it looked like before, some of the reasons for removing the dam. And we also, in that case, and actually in the next 2 cases that I worked on, we made sure that we left a remnant of the dam abutment. So again, for that interpretive purpose. But my point being that, you know, it's not a good idea to write off a pretty modern looking, rather ugly dam as something where you're not going to have historic concerns. You probably will have historic concerns. Okay, with that being said, we're gonna do like a half a minute poll. We're gonna put the answers up. We're gonna ask a quick question. We're gonna put the answers up. When you answer, please know that there's no identifying information linked to the answer, so no one knows what your particular response was on our call. And we have 3 questions, no, 2 questions. And what we're using these questions for is to try to figure out how we can best help folks out there working on dam removals, and also to see if there's a need for any particular information sessions going forward. So Michelle, if you want to go ahead and put up the poll. And we'll be able to see as it's populated. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll wait till most folks have had a chance to answer. Looks like we have another 20 or so. you wouldn't mind just taking a second. Okay, looks like we have all but a dozen or so. I'll give you another 10 seconds to answer if you haven't answered yet.
Beth, there is a question in chat from Carrie Hazelton related to, she asked if we're not a decision maker, should we answer this question?
Well, I think you can still answer it even if you're not a decision maker. In that case, just go with, like let's say you're a community member who's working with a group. If you have no association whatsoever with the permitting process, I would say, maybe not answer it. But if you're working as part of a team that, hopes to have your permits ready in a year, then go ahead and answer that. That's a good question though. I hadn't really thought of that. All right, so I think, Michelle, you can go ahead and pull that down. So it looks like we have 65 folks on the call, and it looks like about 15 have plans to put a permit in the next year, which is pretty good. Okay, so we're gonna switch now, and Kathy's gonna take the presentation for a bit, and then I'll be back to wrap things up. So Michelle, do you wanna close the poll? Or do I, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it on my own screen. I'm one of the people who didn't participate. Sorry, I was looking at some master list there. Okay. So, there we go. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so now I'm just going to review some of the general stages of dam removal in New Jersey. I know there's folks on the line that have a lot of just varied experience, from no experience at all to lots of experience with dam removal, but the purpose of this overview is really just to provide a gist of the process of dam removal in New Jersey rather than delve into too much detail. I do think it's important to remember that every dam removal that we look at is going to be slightly different. So very simple removals may not include all the components that I talk about today, and then we might have complex removals that include way more components that I even dream to get into. But this slide here just outlines the general steps of a dam removal. So we have initial site reconnaissance, which Beth just touched on. We have feasibility study, and then we use the information from our feasibility study to produce a conceptual and or a preliminary design. We can at some point then initiate regulatory coordination and permitting, and then that process is going to give us feedback on our design and our dam removal plan so that we can then generate our final design, and then finally, usually after a couple of years, move forward with project implementation and construction. Next slide. So Beth, again, just mentioned a lot of aspects of initial reconnaissance, but the objective of a reconnaissance is just to collect as much background information as possible on the dam and the site. And it's just a pre-screening before we really jump in and start spending money on a project. So like Beth said, probably most important is who owns the dam, who owns the land around the dam, and do we have their permission to even start investigating dam removal. And again, like she was mentioning, what are the dam uses and its history? Is it obsolete? Is it currently used for recreation? Does it have historical significance? We want to look and see if there's any nearby infrastructure that could be potentially impacted with removal, like roads or bridges or utilities. Are there any rare species or threatened and endangered species that are possibly going to be impacted? And then also, what about sediment? Are there any kind of indicators that we might see some issues with sediment contamination? Do we see a large or moderate amount of sediment behind the dam? Either of these conditions are going to, likely increase our cost and influence how we manage the sediment, and they will affect how we design our dam removal potentially. And then, of course, we also want to think about, what does the community want? What are their interests? What are their concerns? And another important note here that we're not going to focus on this webinar, but we will in future webinars, but it's funding. And you got to think about that early and frequently. But how might we pay for this removal? All right, next slide. So first, let's just talk about the feasibility study. And really what that is a collection of multiple studies, and all of which the general purpose is to either collect or generate information that helps us make decisions regarding project approach and evaluate the potential impacts of dam removal. So feasibility studies can definitely vary based on project complexity, but they typically will include a site survey or mapping effort, sediment surveys, an H&H study or hydrology and hydraulic study. We develop conceptual and preliminary designs that will address our dam removal, but also sediment management, channel restoration, and potentially post-construction planting. We'll conduct studies that help us understand site-specific issues like utilities and infrastructure and impacts to wetlands and threatened endangered species and historic sites. And then usually as part of the feasibility study, we'll start to at least identify the types of permits that we may need for our project and what information we may need to include in our permit applications. And again, like Beth was saying, early in the process of dam removal, we'll need to start thinking about the initial information we need for our federal regulatory consultations. Okay, so now let's delve a little bit more into feasibility studies. So we'll almost always need to conduct some type of site survey or mapping effort. And at the very minimum, we need a site map, and that needs to show us existing or current conditions of the project area. So that's minimally, downstream of the dam itself, the impoundment, and, at least to the upstream end of the impoundment or area of dam's influence. So your map might include information on site topography, general channel morphology, and other kind of relevant features like roads, bridges, infrastructure, natural features. We may also perform a longitudinal survey and take cross sections to better understand the river itself and longitudinal elevations and the shape of the channel geomorphology. And what this will help us do is just kind of understand how this river and the channel will respond to dam removal. And it also might help us to identify areas where we need to make channel adjustments as part of our process. We might also perform a bathymetry survey or also a survey for depth of refusal. These are generally surveys that are done in areas with large impoundments. So a bathymetry study just uses radar or echo technology in the impoundment to provide information on depths, so stream or impoundment depth and different underwater features. And then a survey of depths of refusal just gives us kind of an idea of sediment thickness, as well as an idea to perhaps, if it's unclear where the original channel resided. So if we have a large impoundment, we can set out a grid system, and to measure depth of refusal, the survey will just, the simplest form, use a sediment probe to penetrate through the bottom sediment until the probe hits hardened material and cannot penetrate further, and we'll kind of measure that depth. And then, of course, any number of other surveys could be relevant to our project, such as surveys for wetland boundaries or disputed property boundaries, et cetera. So sediment's a big deal. If we do observe, substantial or even moderate sediment upstream of our dam, we're likely going to have to get into some kind of sediment surveys. And so this might include an assessment of sediment quantity, or the amount of sediment that is stored in our impoundment. So we really need to know how much sediment there is so that we can develop a sediment management plan, and it'll also shape our dam removal itself. But the sediment management plan can vary from, we may decide to allow the sediments to release and disperse naturally downstream with dam removal. Perhaps we can stabilize some of the sediments in the impoundment, or, frankly, we might have to dredge and remove some or all the sediment. But either way, in order to make those decisions, we need to know how much sediment is present. We might also need to investigate sediment quality. So basically determine if our sediment is clean or contaminated. We can do this in a number of different ways, but two common methods. One is to look at sediment cores for toxicity testing. So we can get a core or an array of cores and test for heavy metals, organochlorines, pesticides, et cetera. So it kind of gives us an idea of acute sediment toxicity. Another thing we can do is we can conduct bioassay tests, where basically it's an in-lab test where we expose critters to sediments that we've collected from our site for certain periods of time, and then we start looking at mortality rates. So that kind of gives us an idea of chronic toxicity issues. And again, the more that we know about sediment, just in general, is better, so that we can understand, how sediment will move through the system and what's going to happen after we remove our dam. All right, so next for feasibility study, we have hydrology and hydraulic studies, or H&H studies is probably what you've heard. So hydrology just involves assessing the volume and frequency of flows in a river. So for hydrology, it's just typically a compilation of existing data on river flows from sources like the USGS stream flow gauges, or from FEMA flood studies, or some other source that gives us information regarding flooding recurrence intervals. If for some reason none of those data sources are available or close to our site, then we can start getting into using flow data estimators like USGS StreamStats, or even conduct our own estimation. So in contrast, and on the other side of that, we have hydraulics. And hydraulics will actually involve mathematical modeling. So we take our inputs that we've collected for our hydrology survey. So we get our hydrology data inputs that we compiled, and then we'll use that data in hydraulic calculations. And those are just intended to predict and understand changes that we anticipate in velocity, depth, and scour that may occur with dam removal. Something common in our projects in New Jersey that we see is this is done through modeling, HEC-RAS modeling is what it's called. So 1D or 2D HEC-RAS modeling is all kind of related to this. So really, knowledge of predicted velocities, depths, and scour potential can help us do all sorts of things. For example, it can help us analyze fish passage. So what's going to happen with fish after dam removal? Are they going to be able to traverse this new post-dam flow environment under a different variety of expected flow conditions? These calculations might help us understand how the sediments might move and flush through the system and how quickly that might occur. Or they might help us understand, what actions we might need to take to protect existing infrastructure like bridges from erosion and scour. So they're very helpful. All right, so once we've conducted some of our preliminary feasibility studies, we might actually start producing a conceptual design or a preliminary design, or both. So a conceptual design, this might be an appropriate starting point for some relatively small, simple projects. And it's just effectively can be a map that shows the gist of the design that we have in mind, overlain on a Google Earth image or similar. And what a conceptual design does is it really provides a good visual for stakeholders to come together and have a discussion. It will give us some of the major features of our proposed dam removal, and it might even get into kind of displaying sediment management and channel restoration ideas that we have, but it doesn't necessarily start to incorporate any kind of design specifics or survey data. So for very simple projects or unregulated dams, this might be sufficient at least to get a conversation started. But more often than not, what we see is just kind of a proper preliminary design. So it's a little more advanced, includes multiple engineering drawings. Those drawings will probably reflect the current site conditions prior to dam removal, and then they'll give exact design specifications of our proposed project, including access areas, infrastructure, and associated scour protection measures, again, sediment management, channel restoration features. So for our design process, it's not uncommon to see this or follow a 30-60-90 framework, where a 30% design generally reflects, it's kind of like a detailed conceptual design, and that involves data and proper drawings. And if the 30% concept is approved, then we can move on to a 60% design, and that's more or less a full, fleshed out detailed draft of our approved concept. And then if that passes muster, then we can move on to a 90% design, which is basically just the last check before the design itself is finalized. From a permitting perspective, it's not uncommon for a 30 or sometimes 60% design to go into to the permitters for review and feedback. And I guess it's important to mention here that no design is ever going to be final until the stakeholders and particularly the permitters have provided feedback and approvals for those designs. Another good thing about this preliminary design process is that we can at least start to really understand and generate a guess at a cost estimate. It's probably not going to be our final cost estimate, but we'll at least get into that ballpark, which will help us with funding planning. So we definitely have a later webinar that's going to talk about permitting. So only going to just briefly review permits here that we might typically see with a dam removal project in New Jersey. So again, during the feasibility stage, we want to at least identify those relevant permits that might apply to our project. So this is just a list of permits that's issued by New Jersey DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, the New Jersey DOT, soil conservation districts, and counties. So first we have our DEP General Permits 16 and General Permits 18, where General Permit or GP 16 is a wetland habitat creation or enhancement permit, and 18 is a dam repair permit. So it's not uncommon that our project will actually require both of these, but again, that webinar will get in more detail. So both of these permits are issued by DEP Divisional Land Use, and both generally just outline the expectations and restrictions for project-related wetland and open water disturbances, which are going to happen with most dam removals. Then we have dam safety permits. So these are issued by the DEP Bureau of Dam Safety. And this permit's just going to provide the conditions for which a dam removal can safely take place. And it will very succinctly specify what special conditions must be met for this dam to come out. It's very important to note that dam safety, DEP Dam Safety will always need to explicitly approve our final design before we start going into construction. Sometimes if we have a decent sized impoundment behind our dam, we might have to get a water lowering permit. And those are issued by DEP Division of Fish and Wildlife. And again, you need that permit in order to completely lower a body of water. Often we'll need a soil erosion control permit, and those are issued by one of our state's 15 soil conservation districts. And the general intent of that kind of permit is just to make sure that our construction practices aren't exacerbating erosion. We might need an NJDOT permit if our project potentially affects major roads or bridges or infrastructure. And then we might need a county engineering permit if we're getting in the range of affecting local or county roads or bridges or infrastructure. So any number of permits may be applicable. In this feasibility stage, it's also very smart early in the process to start thinking about federal regulatory compliance. So in the simplest form, if a project uses federal funds or has any kind of federal involvement, which I can go and tell you like is going to be most dam removals, then it's subject to these federal regulatory compliance laws. So typically your lead federal partner who's involved in the project, which in New Jersey, it can be beyond these, but it's typically Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, NOAA, or NIFWIF. But those are the ones that will work with you to complete these compliance actions. And they typically include a NEPA or National Environmental Policy Act analysis, an Endangered Species Act consultation, and a Section 106 Historic Preservation Act consultation. So in short, a NEPA analysis just evaluates the potential impacts of your dam removal project on the human environment. And when I say human environment, I actually mean potential impacts on water resources, socioeconomic resources, biological resources, recreation, air quality, health and safety, etc. Endangered Species Act, ESA Section 7 consult will address the potential impacts of your projects on federally endangered species. And then a Section 106 consultation will assess the impact of the project on established historic resources. So during this historic Section 106 consultation, the lead federal agency and project partners will work typically directly with the State Historic Preservation Office or the SHPO office to evaluate potential effects, and then if there are going to be effects, to come up with mitigative actions. All right, next slide. So once we're done with all our feasibility studies and we've received feedback from all our different stakeholders, including permitters and regulators, this is when we start really getting into this final design phase. So the final design, what it's going to do in a nutshell is provide an engineer or a contractor with plans and specifications that are in sufficient enough detail so that contractor can take those plans and complete the removal as planned and as approved by our permitters and regulators. So the plan itself should specify how the dam should be removed, what that site should look like afterwards. It should include designs for any kind of warranted channel restoration, for sediment management, for access, for infrastructure protection, and even post-construction plantings. The final design plan, it's not uncommon for it to actually specify how to sequence the project, what stage to do at what time. It will specify what kind of equipment needs to be used and specific materials like specific types and sizes of rocks that are needed, and how staging and access should occur. These final design plans, thankfully, are almost always accompanied by a technical memo. And that technical memo is really going to describe the design rationale, and it's going to give you, some more information in a written form than you're seeing on these design sheets themselves. And that's a particularly helpful document, especially for those of us who aren't engineers and then struggle sometimes with interpreting and understanding the underlying intention of some of these design documents. And then most importantly, with a final design, what we're going to get is a really great idea of how much this project is going to cost. So the engineer who produces the design will give us their opinion of itemized costs, and that's based on their design and their specs. And then we can start using that cost to then move forward and pick out an appropriate bidder and contractor to do the construction. Next slide. And brings us to the final stage of dam removal, which, you know, sometimes it might take 3 years to get here, sometimes less, but the final stage just being project implementation and construction. So most agencies and NGOs in New Jersey that are managing dam removal projects are required to have at least 3 bids from prospective contractors. Now, some agencies in our state are restricted to having to choose lowest cost bids, assuming that the bidder is qualified. And then we have other entities that have more flexibility to choose the contractor they really think will be best, but might not be the absolute cheapest. Regardless, it is very likely that all bids, or at least they should, fall that our engineer provided to us. And if they're way off, then something's probably not quite right. So fortunately, in the Northeast in general, there's a ton of contractors with lots of dam removal experience, because this has kind of been a region of hotspot of dam removals in the United States. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of experience in this region. And again, funding, we're going to talk about that in a separate webinar, but it is important that when you're going into bidding as a project manager, that you have secured appropriate funding prior to bidding out that project. It's also very desirable to make sure that you have all of your permits in place prior to issuing a contract, because both of these can be issues that cause a major project delay. And then, you know, once a contract is issued and you've got your person or your group, it's really just a matter of getting the job done. And I know that's not easy, but there's certainly a lot of, you know, it's like an iceberg. You're seeing the construction is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of work that goes underneath it. But one important thing is, you know, your contractor, and they know this, but they have to follow all your permit conditions very rigorously. And, you know, construction, depending on project complexity, it may take a week or a couple of days, or it could take up to a year. It just really depends on the dam and the site. So the contractor in general is going to, you know, mobilize equipment. They're going to prepare site access. If there's an impoundment, they might have to draw down that impoundment. And it's important to note the drawdown of any impoundment should always be a very slow process to make sure any kind of sediment mobilization is reduced and to minimize ecological impacts. If sediments are present in that impoundment or other areas, they have to be addressed according to our sediment management plan. Again, you know, we might remove them, we might stabilize them. And then the next step is usually dam removal itself. And again, dam removal should, like the impoundment drawdown, it should happen pretty slowly, depending on the project, to reduce sedimentation and minimize impacts. After that, you know, we get into channel restoration as warranted, and revegetation is a pretty common, you know, kind of final stage of the dam removal process. So that's about it for the process of dam removal. I'm going to pass it back to Beth, who's going to talk about other considerations and future webinars that we have planned.
Michelle's going to throw up another 30-second poll for us as we transition into our last few slides and talk about other considerations. This requires a little bit more reading than the previous one, but at the same time, it'll help us to get that information that we're talking about, being able to find out who needs what, so that we can start to work on building the strengths of the partnership, and also, you know, help us to maybe design information. It's interesting to watch this populate. A little bit more than halfway, so we'll give it another 10 or 15 seconds for folks to finish. And then we'll get on. I see that we're coming into a crunch time here, and I know that I can stay a little late for questions. I know that's not ideal, but Kathy, can you stay on if, okay.
Absolutely.
All right. And if you have a real hard stop at 2 o'clock and you want to put some urgent question in and direct it so that either Michelle or Eric can know that we'd want to take your question first. Okay. So it looks like we have an even spread of different kinds of technical assistance. And I'm hoping that those not working on a dam removals will change to working on one sooner rather than later. Okay, I'm gonna just continue. Who are the stakeholders? So there's a whole bunch of folks that everyone from landowners to local municipality, your funders. If you're working with bridges, it could be the local county, the state, whole bunch of different stakeholders. And again, bringing together a more diverse team will really build your strength, not only to solve problems, but sometimes when you're dealing with a homeowner or a municipality, it's great to have one partner who's able to step forward, who might be a little bit more acceptable to the person you need to work with, and other partners step back. We'll talk more about this tomorrow on our partners. Our discussion with regulators on the permitting process, as Kathy said, will be a deeper dive. That's on December 14th. The link was put in the chat. You can also find it on NJ Dams. Funding, again, that's on the 15th. And don't be surprised that dam removals generally have multiple funding partners. It's usually something you have to build, and different funders come to the table for different reasons. It might be an ecological reason, a public safety, or maybe even a flooding or other municipal or governmental type interest. And then tomorrow, I know that many of you, not quite all of you are registered for tomorrow's partner organization session, but we'll have a chance to talk with folks tomorrow. We'll have some give overviews, and then we'll have time for questions. Okay, so we're ready to switch to questions if there are any in the chat.
Hey Beth, there is one question so far. People put your questions in chat. From Chris Jerome, is the process the same for small dams that have already failed from a permitting standpoint?
Well, when you say small, do you mean a regulated dam? Because if it is a small failed regulated dam, I think you're pretty much in for the same process. Kathy, would you agree?
Yeah, if it's regulated, you're in for the same process. I'm thinking right now, a great example is, well, I'll call it out, but the Califon Dam on the South Branch Raritan River, which, was breached by ice, I think maybe 2 years ago. And so a lot of times when something like that happens, yeah, the dam owner is faced with repair or removed requests from dam safety. And if that landowner does decide to go with removal, yeah, we're required to go through that same permitting process.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, there is a question about information related to retrofitting a dam that is not coming out, but could benefit from a temperature control device. The example is the outfall on Lake Musconetcong.
Okay, I'm not 100%. Is the question, can it benefit? And I'd say that the answer is yes. And I think that, Kathy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and maybe New Jersey Fish and Wildlife would be the best folks to turn to for that kind of information. Not only to, help mitigate temperatures by pulling water from lower. I think that's what the person is asking. In a dam like that, we tend to have the water coming over the top and downstream, which is the warmer water. So, there are ways to pull water from the bottom. And there's also things like fishways that can be added to a dam that just simply is not coming out.
So there are benefits
yeah.
and information. Contact U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and New Jersey Fish and Wildlife?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. There, yeah, it's kind of outside of this, I guess, the scope of this talk, but there are definitely devices and different technologies that can be used to maintain temperatures and to try to, reestablish the natural, conditions, even though a dam is present, as much as possible that we have to work with in our state. But yeah, it's a little different than dam removal, I guess, also.
Great. There's one final question. What makes a dam a regulated dam?
Short answer, it's got to be at least 5 feet. Although we do see some dams that are not quite 5 feet that wind up on that regulated list. Can you think of any other part of that answer, Kathy?
Not unless it serves some, it may be less than 5 feet, but serves some, greater purpose, such as water withdrawal or some other purpose. It may be on that list. Yeah, so dams are mostly the 5 foot is the good denoter of a regulated dam, but there's probably some special circumstances.
I can clarify that.
And it's important to note that a regulated dam, I think the height is different in the coastal part of the state as it is in some of the other areas. So that may vary across where you are geographically. Like in the Pinelands, it might be different.
Do we have someone from Dam Safety who just said they'd like to add to that?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Beth?
Yeah.
It's Clint. So
Great.
yes, the definition of a dam is 5 foot measured from the downstream toe or invert of the outlet pipe to the top of dam or emergency spillway in the absence of emergency spillway. In the Pinelands, we do have a special provision that allows the height to be 8 feet. Again, it has to meet other provisions, but anything under 8 feet in the Pinelands, 1 square mile of drainage area or less, we cannot call that a regulated dam as far as they don't have to submit anything to our office. So Pinelands 8 feet, everything else is 5 feet. Anything below 5 feet is not regulated by our office, but land use would have regulatory control over that extreme encroachment program. Anything not 5 feet or greater.
Okay, and I'll
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, I'll also point folks to the Bureau of Dam Safety's website. There's a whole bunch of information on there that you can poke around in for exactly that kind of information. And I'm guessing that they can reach you or someone at your office via that website?
Correct. All our contact info is on there. Can reach out to anybody on the website and we'll get you an answer.
Okay, any other questions? I'm not actually looking at the chat, so relying on Eric or Michelle.
I don't see any new ones.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you at the upcoming 3 sessions. And again, don't hesitate to forward the registration information on to other people that you think may be interested. You can communicate with us via the NJ Dams or at my email address, which you all have by virtue of having received this invitation or this link. Okay. All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
folks.